Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It was another rainy day in Avon, Maine. It seemed like another biblical flood was on the rise, being that this was the 4th straight day. My brother Zack and I inherited our grandma's house, and like most old places, there wasn't much for creature comforts. The power would be out more often than not, and our Uncle Bob gambled until winning pocket change felt trivial. The wood stove became our central hub, and telling stories became equivalent to watching television. Most were funny, Uncle Bob telling us his past exploits in a world that barely existed now. After a time, we all got quiet, the old clock on the walls ticking the only sound. Something was on Bob's mind, and it seemed he was figuring out how to tell it. After a few more moments went by, he seemed to come to terms with it.
You boys ever hear about old Doc Marshall? It's not really a ghost story, just a bit of eerie history. It was about 80 years ago, and he was the only doctor for miles around. He did the normal stuff, delivering babies, resetting bones, and stopping everyone from bleeding when they got injured. For many years, he quietly went about his business. He lived on a hill 3 miles from town, and no one bothered him unless they had an emergency. It was always almost by telephone if they did. Phones had just arrived in these parts about the time he started doctoring. 30 years later, half the town was hooked up on party lines. Those that didn't have a phone knew where the nearest one was. When he got into his 50s, he became bored with the normal doctoring tasks, started experimenting with surgery on animals. It started with little things like trying to switch parts on dogs and cats. Eventually, he got into brain surgery on them and tried to alter their functions. He even tried to switch brains with a dog and a pig. That was a failure, and both animals died. Being the only medical professional in the area, his duties also entailed dealing with people when they died. There was an undertaker, but his job was only embalming and burials. If there needed to be an autopsy, then it was up to old Doc Marshall. Part of his experiments involved keeping animal parts half alive so he could transplant them. Eventually, he started trying to save a human body part, once in a while, just to see how long he could keep it. He ended up building an extensive laboratory in his basement. His experiments with animals continued, and he got better at keeping them alive. One of his first successes was putting a cat's head and pig's legs onto a dog's body. It only lived 3 weeks after putting it together, though. The winter of '73 turned out to be brutally cold. Not much snow, but a lot of wind. The flu was severe that year, and quite a few townfolk were dying or near death. Doc Marshall sectioned off half of his basement and turned it into a quarantine hall for those near death with the flu. A couple of local guys, Zeke and Silas, were tasked with bringing in the patients and removing corpses. Doc Marshall didn't have time to experiment with animals during the winter. His curiosity got the best of him, though, and when someone died, he tried to keep a part of them in his lab section. Before long, he thought that if he saved all the right parts, maybe he could build his own human body. He spent many nights sewing parts together and keeping his project alive by circulating blood through it. By February, he'd nearly had a complete body. He lacked a heart and a brain. He was so close, and he knew that he couldn't use dead parts for those. He'd used mostly male parts for his project, except a few intestines of women. kept his eye out for perfect specimens for the brain and heart. All of a sudden, the flu relented and patients stopped coming in. How could he finish his project? His quarantine hall was nearly empty, and he was so close. Then his last patient got better, and Zeke and Silas were called to escort them home. Doc Marshall asked them when they left if they'd come back and have a little celebration with him, because they'd finally beaten the outbreak. They agreed and said they'd come back on Friday night. Doc figured that he only needed one of them to finish his project, but wanted to learn which was a better candidate. Friday night came and they arrived around 7. Doc had some whiskey, so they all started doing shots. After a few, Zeke started to feel ill, and then ran outside and vomited on the lawn. He came back in and said they ought to head back to town. Doc asked Silas if he wanted to stay longer, and he'd get him back later. He agreed, and Zeke stumbled back into his truck and slowly headed out. Doc asked Silas if he wanted to tour the laboratory. He said sure, after another shot. Doc took the opportunity to slip a little tranquilizer into that one. They went down to the lab, and Silas was intrigued by all the beakers and glass piping everywhere. Then he started feeling tired. Doc said, "That's no problem. There's a bed right over there." Silas was out when he hit the bed. Doc proceeded to take care of his intended task. It took the rest of the night and into the morning to complete. He'd taken Silas's heart and brain and put them into his creation. Then his plan was to give it one little shot of electricity to get everything started. 3, 2, 1, zap! The thing started to move slowly with some low moaning sounds. Doc was full of pride, and he put his hands on the beast to convince himself that he really did it. All of a sudden, smack! The beast swung its left arm and caught Doc behind the ear. Down he went, out cold. The beast then went for what was left of Silas and had quite a feast before breaking out of the basement and into the world. Later that night, Doc came to and was nursing his wound when the phone rang. It was Zeke, calling to see where Silas was. Doc came up with a lie quickly and told Zeke that Silas had gone berserk in the morning and smacked him upside the head and left. Word got out that Silas had gone crazy, and the local sheriff tried to track him down with no success. Strange things started happening after that. Things that came up missing, and some people too. Women in the wrong place at the wrong time were getting taken advantage of, and when some of them decided to have the baby, a troll-like creature came out. Most were disposed of immediately. Some were tried to be raised, but ended up running off wild when they got old enough.
After he finished, the quiet washed over us again. I think we both wanted to ask questions, but neither of us did. Finally, he seemed to snap back to his usual jovial self and clapped his hands together.
Well, enough about that. What do you boys say to a game of sharpshooters, eh?
We went over to the kitchen table to set up the cards, and I looked out the window into the night. Still a downpour, but from the dim light of the moon, I swore I could make out the silhouettes of a few vague figures by the woodline. Zack handed me a beer, and when I went to look back, there was nothing. "Hey Matt, you all right?" "Yeah," I replied. "Just seeing things."
Chilling tales for dark nights.